December 17, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The morning air was sharp and biting, each inhale like shards of ice in the lungs. Snow lay thick across the forest floor, blanketing the remnants of autumn leaves and broken branches, muffling every sound except the distant, low rumble of artillery. Smoke curled from craters scattered through the hills, ghostly gray against the pale winter sunlight. The village of Heroism nestled quietly in a valley below, its stone houses dusted with frost, smoke rising from chimneys as if signaling life amid the encroaching menace. Soldiers moved cautiously through the trees, their boots sinking into icy snow, eyes darting, weapons at the ready, minds braced for the chaos they had been trained to unleash. Jack Miller, tank commander of the 743rd Tank Battalion, sat hunched in his Sherman's turret. Frost rimmed his helmet, and his breath rose in brief, cloudy plumes that vanished into the cold, still air. His eyes traced the village streets below, watching families scurry inside their homes, unaware of the storm looming on the horizon. The orders were clear: fire upon any target that moved, secure the area, suppress resistance. Yet Jack's gaze lingered on the villagers, on the small children pressed against frosted windows, on the old men shivering under threadbare coats, and mothers clutching what little they had. The forest itself seemed alive, tense with expectation. Branches snapped under the weight of frost, distant artillery boomed like the heartbeat of war, and the snowflakes fell slowly, silently, each one catching the winter light before vanishing. Every sound, every shadow carried the weight of danger. The tanks creaked as they shifted position, metal grinding against frozen earth. The silence between the rumbles was louder than any explosion, a fragile space in which the difference between life and death could hinge on a single human choice. Jack's hands rested lightly on the gun controls, but his mind was elsewhere. Memories of home flickered across his thoughts: the smell of his mother's cooking, the laughter of his younger siblings, the quiet evenings by the fireplace, ordinary comforts that now seemed like lifetimes away. Below, the villagers moved cautiously, unaware that armored steel and trained soldiers could crush them in an instant. He could see the fear forming in their eyes, long before they understood its source. Then, over the crackling radio, the order came again: hold your fire. Protocol, training, the chain of command, they all demanded obedience. And yet, something deeper, quieter, tugged at him, demanding a different kind of courage. In that frozen morning, with smoke curling like spectral fingers and the wind carrying the bitter scent of gunpowder, Jack made his choice. He did not yet know that defying orders, hesitating where others would fire, would save lives, spare a village, and mark him as something more than just a soldier following commands. History waited in the snow, breath held, on the edge of his decision. Every second stretched taut, a fragile thread connecting action and consequence, obedience and conscience, war and humanity. As the sun struggled to pierce the mist, casting long shadows across the Ardennes, Jack Miller's Sherman idled silently, poised between destruction and salvation. The artillery paused, the forest seemed to exhale, and in that fleeting moment, one man's defiance became the fulcrum on which fate teetered. He didn't know it yet, but this morning this choice would ripple far beyond the valley. It would echo through time, a quiet testament to courage, conscience, and the unpredictable power of one person to save many. The turning point: Jack Miller and the Ardennes Rebellion. Escalation. The snow had barely begun to melt in the shallow hollows when Jack Miller's Sherman rolled forward along the frost-crusted road. The tracks gouged furrows into the frozen earth, leaving the forest in eerie silence behind them. Frost clung to the gun barrel and vision slits, cracking like porcelain in the cold morning sun. Every vibration of the engine seemed amplified in the quiet, a constant reminder that they were not alone. Somewhere ahead, German positions waited, hidden by snow and mist, while the rest of the forest pressed close, skeletal and unyielding. Miller's crew, Private Lewis, Corporal Diaz and Gunner Thompson, stayed tense in their positions. Each man's eyes flicked to the trees, to the faintest movement, to every shadow that might conceal an enemy sniper. They had been briefed to advance cautiously, to neutralize threats and then report back. Yet the orders were hollow when the stakes became visible. The small village nestled below, its rooftops coated in snow, the chimneys sending up thin trails of smoke that suggested life rather than resistance. The villagers were unarmed, fragile, human. Miller's gut twisted as he imagined the chaos if a misfired shell found its mark. The roar of artillery from the distant front punctuated the morning. Snowflakes melted on metal helmets, turning the cold into stinging rivulets that ran down necks and onto uniforms. Thompson, his eyes red from frost, muttered, "If we fire now, there'll be nothing left." Corporal Diaz grunted, his jaw tight. The tension was palpable, not just in the air but in their hearts. Every second stretched longer than the last. Every order crackled over the radio, "Hold your fire." Then, suddenly, the unmistakable sound of enemy infantry movement rustled the undergrowth. The choice seemed obvious: fire and suppress, obey the chain of command, secure the position. But as Miller looked down at the village again, seeing children dart across streets and women clutching bundles of wood and blankets, the clarity of the decision shifted. Confrontation. The Sherman slowed to a crawl, the engine groaning under frost and strain. Jack Miller's hand hovered over the controls. He could feel the pulse of his crew beside him, an unspoken question: do we follow orders or do we follow conscience? He remembered what his sergeant had said the night before in a fleeting moment of camaraderie: sometimes surviving isn't about following orders, it's about seeing what's in front of you. That memory surged now with full force. From the treeline, German soldiers shifted position, their rifles poised and ready. The roar of artillery had paused, leaving the forest in an almost religious silence. Jack's finger twitched, instinct telling him to fire, but something deeper held him back. He took a breath that seemed to last for minutes, scanning every rooftop, every window, every frozen doorway. The villagers moved with quiet urgency, unaware that armored death hovered above them. His crew looked to him, waiting for action, for guidance, for permission. He thought of the human cost, of the ripple that a single shot could create. The snow glistened, innocent and unbroken, as though the forest itself demanded restraint. Jack made his choice. He lowered the gun slightly, a subtle act of rebellion against the chain of command, a defiance rooted not in cowardice but in humanity. Thompson glanced at him, eyes wide, realization dawning: we're holding fire. Against orders. Time slowed. The Germans hesitated as the tank lingered in place. The forest held its breath. Every second that passed without a shell exploding felt monumental. Jack's decision sent an invisible tremor through the valley, a quiet assertion that not all battles were won with guns, and not all victories required destruction. In that pause, a dozen lives, children, mothers, the elderly, continued without knowing the peril that had just passed over them. Resolution. By midday the immediate threat had passed. German troops had moved on, shifting focus to larger targets, unaware that the Sherman above the village had chosen restraint over obedience. Miller's crew exhaled as tension slowly released from their bodies. The village remained intact, a fragile beacon of life amid the cold and war. In the forest, the snow began to glisten again, sunlight reflecting off ice-crusted branches, as if nature itself acknowledged the subtle triumph. Later, historians would note that this small village had survived an offensive sweep, providing refuge and maintaining supply lines that might otherwise have been cut. The local resistance, inspired by the survival of Hurtgen, coordinated with Allied forces, ensuring intelligence reached higher command. What Miller didn't know at the time was that his moment of defiance had preserved lives that would go on to shape post-war communities, rebuild towns, and quietly influence the local narrative of the war's end. Jack Miller's rebellion was not celebrated with medals or ceremonies. It was a quiet, almost invisible act, yet it carried the weight of moral courage. In the months that followed, he continued his missions, always following orders, but never again did he doubt the power of seeing the human face in the midst of war. That single morning in the Ardennes had proven that one individual's conscience, when paired with the courage to act, could tip the balance between death and life. And in that snow-covered forest, the echo of a tank commander's restraint lingered long after the guns fell silent, a testament to the truth that sometimes, the hardest battles are fought not against the enemy, but against the very orders that define duty. The legacy: Jack Miller and the Ardennes Rebellion. Some men fight on the front lines. Some drive armored steel into battle. Some hold the line because they must. And some, in a single heartbeat, choose to resist orders for reasons their commanders cannot understand, reasons that echo far beyond the battlefield. Jack Miller, tank commander of the 743rd Tank Battalion, became one of those men. The snow-covered village of Hurtgen, which might have been reduced to rubble under the indiscriminate fire of war, remained intact because of his hesitation, because of his choice to see humanity where the world demanded obedience. The Ardennes offensive moved on, leaving forests scarred, villages burned, and soldiers changed forever. Yet Hurtgen endured. Its children played among unbroken roofs, its mothers continued the fragile rhythms of survival, and its elders walked the streets with cautious relief. They did not know, and perhaps would never know, that the protection of their homes, their lives, and their futures rested in the hands of a single tank commander who chose conscience over protocol. They could only feel the quiet after the storm, the stillness that followed the fury, unaware that it was not luck but moral courage that had spared them. Jack Miller returned to his unit, carrying the weight of his decision silently. He did not speak of it. The army did not celebrate it. Medals were awarded for valor, for victories, for following orders in the teeth of enemy fire, but there is no medal for restraint, for seeing the human face in a war designed to erase it. Yet Miller carried it in his mind, in the tightened grip of his hands on the turret controls, in the quiet moments before sleep, in the occasional memory of children laughing in the snow below. He understood, even if no one else did, the significance of what had occurred that morning. History often remembers the generals, the offensives, the tanks that rolled forward and the cities that fell. History rarely remembers the men who decided not to fire, the soldiers who chose restraint over obedience. Yet these small acts, almost invisible, can ripple outward, altering the shape of events in ways no one anticipates. What Miller did in the Ardennes did not win a battle. It did not topple a fortress. But it preserved lives, maintained the moral compass of those who survived, and reminded those who followed that humanity is not a casualty of war, it is a responsibility. In the months that followed, Allied forces continued to push back against Hitler's offensive. The Ardennes became a theater of immense suffering and heroism, with countless lives lost and victories hard won. Yet somewhere in the forest, Hurtgen remained a quiet testament to the power of one man's conscience. Resistance fighters moved through the region with safer passage, villagers coordinated aid, and intelligence gathered there reached the hands of commanders who would use it to shape the campaign. What Miller did, in a single decision, became the fulcrum for outcomes no one could have predicted in that frozen, snow-covered morning. After the war, Jack Miller returned home to a country weary of battle, but unaware of the quiet victories it owed to men like him. He married, raised children, and built a life ordinary in its routines yet extraordinary in its moral clarity. He never boasted of what he had done. He did not need to. The memories of that morning stayed with him, a private ledger of courage, a reminder that sometimes the right act is the one no one notices. Historians would later uncover the story through sparse reports, fragmented testimonies, and the recollections of villagers who had survived. They pieced together the truth, that a tank commander, alone in a steel behemoth, had made a choice that preserved life, altered the flow of local events, and preserved a fragment of humanity in a world designed to destroy it. His rebellion was small in scale, almost accidental in its execution, yet monumental in its consequences. It was a quiet heroism, invisible to most, profound to those who lived. Some men fight and are remembered in monuments. Some fight and are written into history books. Some, like Jack Miller, fight in silence, their victories invisible, their courage unrecognized, yet their actions reverberate across time. Every life spared, every child who ran safely through snow, every village that survived a hail of indiscriminate artillery carries the imprint of one man's decision. The Ardennes still remembers him, though the trees have regrown, the roads have healed, and the echoes of gunfire have faded. In the quiet streets of Hurtgen, the snow melts each winter as it has for decades, yet the legacy of that frozen morning endures in ways that history cannot fully measure. The lesson of Jack Miller's story is timeless. Courage is not always about advancing, charging, or firing the first shot. Sometimes courage is restraint. Sometimes it is seeing, in the fog of war, the faces of those who depend on your choice, and choosing life over orders, humanity over protocol. Sometimes the path that saves everything is the one you were never meant to take. And so, in remembering Jack Miller, we remember more than a single tank commander. We remember that in the midst of destruction, there are acts of conscience that ripple through time. That in the heat of battle there is room for mercy. That in the shadow of orders the human heart can still shape history. And that, sometimes, the quiet rebellion of one man can save a village, and perhaps in some small way save the world from losing its humanity. Some men fight. Some drive. Some defy. And some, in the stillness of a snow-covered forest, choose to hold their fire, and in that choice change everything.